Well, good morning. This is the only audience of this size that applauds for the composer before they even hear the music. Isn't that awesome?
That works to my advantage, I think.
So Matthew Whittall, who's joining us from Finland, but his DNA is a Canadian boy from Quebec.
It is. Proud Quebecer.
Yeah. So it's so fun when I get to send an email invitation to a composer and ask them to compose a work for this exciting round, because I get to tell them about you. You know, most people, if you say, I'd like you to write a 10-minute quartet for the world's biggest string quartet competition, and they're going to play it 10 times in a row in one concert. They're like, that's not going to work. And I'm like, no.
I can confirm that, actually.
Yeah. And this audience's favorite event has become the Canadian Commission round, even though, for the most part, this is not an audience of new music experts. So it's really interesting. It's really interesting to the composer. What is the excitement about this round that you all feel? And I've spoken to so many of you about that. And so there's a few things that we share with the composers. One is, it's the first time we get to see the same piece back to back. So you feel empowered in a certain way in understanding who you really think is best or what are the differences. It's very clear. You get an opinion right away. Well, that was cool. So sort of like a kaleidoscope, same piece, you turn it. And so I was really interested because Matthew, rather than just being excited that the piece gets presented, you actually wrote a piece keeping in mind the impact of 10 performances.
Yeah, I really did.
I think you're the first composer that spoke to me about that.
Well, it was really important to me because, I'm a teacher as well, and one of the things I stress to my students all the time is passive listening, to put themselves in the position of the listener, of just the person who's hearing your piece. Are you entertained? It's a dirty word in modern music, entertained.
It wasn't a dirty word in Haydn's time, as we saw.
It was not, yeah. And I think actually it's a very Haydn-esque piece in that way. But are you entertained? Are you captivated by it? In this moment, are you drawn into the piece, or are you feeling it's a little arcane or whatnot? So I always encourage my students to put aside whatever they intend for the piece to do on a technical level and just experience it as music, as a listener. And so for me, it was really important for this event to think of what would make an interesting experience 10 times in a row, because there's a lot of things I can imagine wanting to do for 9 minutes with a string quartet, but there are not many things that I want to hear 10 times in a row. So I purposely designed the piece to be a little bit difficult to follow at first. It's kind of cross-cut very rapidly between different styles and events, and the intent is that for the first few listenings, you can't really recall the precise sequence of events. You might recall that something happened, but not exactly when. And so the piece becomes quite disorienting before actually turning back to more familiar stuff.
Interesting, and I think, what you shared with me earlier, just some background, pretty much every composer that I've reached out to write this work for the competition has had some reticence. I mean, there's excitement, well, that's great, commission, it's going to be on radio, it's in Banff Center, wait a second. I'm going to be the composer that writes a piece that follows Haydn, Bartók, Ligeti, Beethoven, and there's I'm not so sure. You, right away, as soon as I reached out to you, you shared with me that string quartet composition had intimidated you earlier in your career, and you were excited to come back to this, but there was a little bit of a process, right?
Okay, I'll tell you what happened, because this is a funny story. Because just before you reached out to me, maybe a couple of weeks earlier, some friends of mine in Finland who are form a touring string quartet called Metaphor, it's very clever. They had asked me to write them a fairly short string quartet that they could take on tour and plug into whatever kind of mainstream program, so 8 to 10 minutes. And I had been so hesitant after the experience of my first quartet, which was only a partially successful piece, I would say. Some nice ideas, but it had just been a very traumatic experience writing this massive piece that I didn't feel had succeeded. And they kind of poked me for a while, and I said, oh, okay, fine. For you guys, I'll do it. I'll write a piece for people I know really well. It'll be intimate, and we can work on it. And then Barry sent me an email. And this piece was going to come up first, and I thought, great. There goes my opportunity to wade back in very, very delicately with my friends. Now I'm going to do this on a big public platform. But honestly, it was kind of trial by fire. And by the end of this whole process of writing this piece that you're going to hear today, and then my third string quartet, which I just finished last week before I got here, for my friends, I got sucked back into the string quartet big time. I'm just fired up about it.
That's awesome.
Give me a couple of years to recover and get out of my way for number 4.
Now, you're writing a lot of music. I listen to a lot of your stuff online, and you write for a lot of other instruments.
Yeah, I do.
So winds, a lot of wind music.
That comes up a lot. especially in chamber music.
Yeah.
I write for strange combinations of instruments. Bass, clarinet, and guitar. That was a fun one.
And there was one you shared earlier, flute and
alto flute, viola, and harp.
Alto flute, viola,
Yeah.
and harp. Yeah,
Yeah.
beautiful. So you have this opportunity, this roughly 10 minutes of empty space to write. How do you get to the first idea of music we're going to hear?
That's actually not very hard. The first idea, I can write like the first minute of anything. Just tell me you're going to write a 10-minute orchestra piece or a 20-minute orchestra piece, and I'll have the first minute of it ready for you tomorrow. It's what comes after. That's a very, very big problem for me, because I don't think in very linear or developmental terms. I guess like the biggest influence on the way I think musically would be Debussy, who writes in vignettes.
Yeah.
There's not too much in the way of transition or linear development in Debussy, and that's very much how I think. So I'm not really thinking in terms of beginning, middle, end. I'm thinking beginning, 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 end. So it's always a question of how to string all of these little beginnings together into a coherent line that has a story to tell. So I would describe, there's a very popular internet meme that circulates about the creative process that goes, this is awesome, this is harder than I thought, this sucks, I suck, this might not be so bad, this is awesome. That's really kind of the process where I get that initial idea out very quickly, and then it's a long, traumatic, painful process of trying to figure out what the implications of it are and how to string it into a piece of that length or of approximately that length. And it's never really done until that final piece falls into place, and then the whole structure goes up like one of those tents that you just throw and it kind of goes.
So something that the competition has always embraced is we never tell a composer what to write, how to write, the level of difficulty we're looking for. We don't like this stuff. We don't do that. But we do say, these are the 10 best quartets of our time. They are going to devour your music. So we encourage, don't be afraid of writing whatever you want. The only criteria is we don't allow any staging of the piece. There's no, like I think of some of Murray Schafer's quartets that I've played that involve actual theatrical entrances and exits and even costume. We don't allow that. And we have no use of electronics, not because we don't like them, just because we didn't want to have we don't want our incredibly gifted sound engineers to be responsible for a quartet's disaster when something goes wrong. Not that you guys would ever do that.
Oh no, having worked in electronics occasionally,
you don't want to be responsible for that.
Wrong.
So this is like, so you sent me early on a little excerpt, or this is what I've started to write, and I looked at it, and I went, well, this looks interesting, but any of these quartets can sight read this particular excerpt. Now, So I just shared that with you, right? I shared basically that, great, this doesn't look terribly difficult. Are you sure? And so that was a kind of really interesting conversation I was having just internally. Like, does it matter how difficult the piece is in terms of what it takes to deliver a performance right away? And what, or not? Or is it more important that the piece just allows for different different interpretations? So you kind of pushed back. There was a bit of, I'm not really interested in all of that difficult.
And I'm really not.
Right, and so I think that's really interesting.
Well, for me, I guess what it came down to for me was I sort of rejected the premise that the commission piece has to necessarily provide a technical challenge, a visibly technical challenge. I was just interested in writing, first of all, I was interested in writing a string quartet, not a piece for string quartet, not a competition piece, but an actual capital S, capital Q string quartet that had a journey, that had material that transforms over, that provided like this kind of vast epic journey in that space of time. And providing that as kind of one of the word we got stuck on, I think, was challenging. Right. And I love that I get to tell this story because I went in and I asked the first quartet I worked with, I think the Vera quartet, is it hard? Because I'm not a string player, I don't really know. Is it hard? Is it easy? And one of them said, well, it's challenging. And I went, so, but for me, the challenge, honestly, that I really set for them, even though the ideas in this piece are incredibly simple, and I did try to throw them little curves. Like, one of my favorite things to do is write really fast music that is just a single line of music, but that is fragmented intensely across the whole ensemble, so that they have to work very hard at maintaining the coherence of that line. That's one of the things. But the other challenge that I set to them was that I'm kind of a magpie as a composer. I'm just influenced by so many different things that sometimes they don't kind of digest into a single language. That's what happened in this piece. And it's fragmented into many, many different styles. Post-minimalism, romanticism. There's some really heavy 12-tone stuff that goes on in the piece, very dissonant. But all of that was sort of strung together in this kind of fruit salad of styles. And I think that was one of the major challenges that they had to face, was making that coherent, because it shifts gears so many times so quickly during the piece that they have to actually realize that it's not a series of different ideas. It's one idea that runs through different styles. Because I think of style as kind of key. Like, there's a kind of modulation that takes place from one style to the other, in a very intuitive way, but sometimes very abruptly. And I think that's one of the harder things for players to adapt to, that maybe in minimalist music we use less vibrato. Oh, this is romantic, we can use tons of vibrato. This is 12 tones, so we should be kind of spooky and angsty.
It's fascinating. Now, I'm looking out at this audience, and this is a very special place with really committed listeners. That's normal in Finland. There are a lot of festivals with really passionate listeners, and per capita, the amount of music making is just beyond anything we've seen in this country. The type of investment of the state in the arts is just beyond compare. But I'm curious how that affects your writing there compared to writing in North America.
Well,
do you feel like audience, when you write a piece for the Helsinki Chamber Music Society, this is a more adventurous audience, or an audience that is?
Oh, in that sense, sure. I mean, it depends where the piece is going. If I'm asked to write a piece for a new music festival, then I might be, given to be more extreme about certain things. Like, a lot of what I do is rooted in minimalism. And just before I wrote the Banff piece, I was writing a piece for mixed ensemble for a wonderful group from Dublin called the Crash Ensemble that was visiting Helsinki's new music festival. And since they specialize in minimalist and post-minimalist music, and it was a new music festival, I felt like I could be really repetitive, really hardcore, like very, very stripped down, because that was the occasion for it. So yeah, I do take that into account, but most of there's very little pressure on content when you get commissioned over there. It's just, we want a piece, do what you like. And the taking the audience into account, taking the occasion into account. That's just something that I do naturally. It's something that's very important to me.
How important is audience to you as a composer? I mean, I'm asking that, not to...
Paramount importance.
Paramount.
I'm
Because that's definitely
always
not
on
with
the
all
side of the
composers,
audience. Not in terms of just, it's not a give the people what they want thing at all. I tend to think of, my analogy is like giving a Christmas gift or any kind of gift to someone. You don't necessarily give them what you want, you give them what they didn't know they wanted, but they're still going to love. So I guess my primary allegiance is to the not to the audience, to the listener, to the right, because they're giving me their time. In most cases, they'll be paying money to come and be imprisoned with my piece for however long. And I want that time to be pleasant. And to them, even if it's an extreme experience, I want their time to be filled well.
Yeah. So I've said this to you before, and it's really important that you know this coming to this round, maybe more than others, is that you are playing an incredibly active role in the music making, the art making that's going to happen today. Because remember, these quartets have been practicing this piece for the most part in a studio playing for themselves. Maybe a few of them have done a test run for some friends or in a small concert, but there's not an experience of feeling when I send out that idea, did it actually work? That much time going that, And so when they walk out, real time feeling that energy of the audience on that journey, the performances change. And so in fact, we don't know what this piece is until it's lived through the performance with a living audience. And 10 of those is really interesting. A couple of the quartets, 2 actually, I bumped into. I said, "Oh, great! Looking forward to hearing you. When am I going to hear you?" "Oh, I'm playing, third or fourth or second." And I'm really. I said, "Oh, that and we're really excited about that because we get to go into the hall and listen to the rest of them, and they're excited to hear the piece, just like you, It's not about they're excited to see did we play as well as the next group. It's to hear that piece through the eyes of different performers.
And they are extremely individual. I've heard all 10 quartets play it, and I've coached them. I spent yesterday and Wednesday coaching them on it, and they've come up with a much greater diversity of perspectives on the piece than I expected. I kind of created a ground where some things that I would normally request more specifically in the score or notate more specifically, vibrato, shading, that kind of mood, I left quite open.
Yeah.
And my goal in coaching them wasn't to mainstream any of their versions of the piece, their interpretations, but just to help them do what they were doing a little bit better.
Right.
And they've brought so many different takes on tempo and rhythm and the feel and the styles that it's just really incredibly gratifying.
So something just so you understand how this works, the musicians are sent the music once we receive it from Matt, and inevitably questions will come up. What did that mean? What does that? And the process is that the competition sends those questions to Matt. He answers them, and the answers disseminated among all 10 groups. There's no privilege given to any group around. We asked a question, so this is just about finding the most information possible to deliver the best performance. And so you came from Finland to work with these groups. That process started when?
Wednesday afternoon. So I saw basically they would play their romantic round, and then.
And how much time did you spend with each of the groups?
About 30 minutes, which was in some cases barely enough, and sometimes more than enough. But we kept it very fair, and we spent 30 minutes working on it. And I think that they all got very different information out of me based on what they asked me. Some of them heard some of the weird stories behind, they asked me what the title was, and I said, I don't know. I was just massively drunk at the time I came up with it. And I don't even really know what it means. I still don't know what it means. It's it had all of these associations that fed into the piece, or a bit of notation where they asked me, why is there a tempo shift when we have to do this completely arrhythmic pizzicato thing, because there's no pulse to latch onto and you have a tempo shift? And I said, well, I had sketched out that part of music and it connected better before, but then I inserted something before it and I just couldn't be bothered figuring out what it would be in that tempo. And so I thought, well, it's an extra challenge. They have a tempo shift, but there's no pulse. But sometimes they got very technical information out of me, and we all had just a really great individual time. I wouldn't be able to say that I picked any favorite, because as soon as I started working with a group, what they were doing became my new favorite thing with the piece.
You know, I say this every time that we do this round, but whether or not you like the music, or I like the music, or the performers like the music, separate from that whole concept, there's something that is really important that comes from this round, which is that we're reminded that the people that composed much of the other music, I'm speaking of the dead composers, were at one time just living normal people. And we put them up on that pedestal, and we lose our ability to really have dialogue with them, and so the music suffers greatly. And so when we work with a living composer, we're reminded that actually that's how composition works. And so when we look at old scores, Haydn, Dvorak, whatever it is, there's a freedom that you feel, not in that you can play anything you want, but a freedom in treating the composer just as one of the performers, that actually these were normal, living, breathing people, and we have to be reminded that you can speak to them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a wonderful Facebook group called, pardon the language, but it's actually called Composers Doing Normal Shit. And it's just pictures of famous composers doing something utterly normal, like playing ping pong, or and it's a reminder of that. Of these are normal people who had normal work lives and families and bills to pay, and I think that over reverence of composers as artists, of the great canon of musical works, is one of those things that I'm kind of most passionate about breaking down, that composers need to be brought back to earth as people who produced work and they interacted with musicians, and that their work doesn't become fixed in time, and interpretation is entirely contingent. Yeah,
I mean, it's one of the reasons why we have that irreverent bandstand in MacLab. I mean, of course it's fun that you go down and have a beer and people are playing music, that's lovely, but it's actually, it's to demonstrate exactly that Haydn, who was played so spectacularly in this hall, would suffer if he'd lived only in this tense environment. And then you go down to the MacLab and people are reading Haydn quartets, and the banter, the conversational element, without the pressure of you listeners, and helped by a glass of beer, is something that I think we've all enjoyed seeing, and that dialogue between highbrow, lowbrow has been really fun. Yeah. We want to give you a chance to ask Matt some questions. So I don't know if it's possible to turn any more lights on in the house. It's a little hard to see you. I
can see one
yes,
question
we have
right
one.
here
Yeah,
in the
thank you.
front.
That's great. And speak loud, please.
Okay, very interesting, but I'm a little disappointed, and I think it's based on a misconception of what was going to happen at this. Here's a true or false question for you, Matt.
A true or false question, okay.
True or false question. You are not allowed, or you are not allowing yourself to tell us anything about your concept, the intent of the piece, what your hopes for the piece were, what the structure of the piece is. True or false?
You mean from
no.
us?
Or from himself.
Or from himself. So quickly from us, completely false. He can do whatever he wants.
Yeah, it's. I would say the question is, I'm not allowed, or I'm not allowing myself to talk about the piece. No, that's false. It just didn't come up. So, I can tell you a little bit about the piece without giving too much away. As I said, the piece is meant to be a little bit disorienting on the first take, deliberately so. And the opening of the piece, I'm not going to tell you exactly what it does, but its intent is to just make people think, oh, it's that kind of piece. Okay, I get it. Here we go. Until the moment where it stops being that kind of piece. So that is one intent of the piece, is purposely to be disorienting. But another aim that I had in the piece, and this is something that actually social media was very helpful for in writing the piece, because I could, post a violin double harmonic or something, and then say, violinists weigh in, is this possible? And then I'd have Jaakko Kuusisto,
Yeah.
wonderful violinist, and all these amazing violinists in Finland and abroad weighing in saying, yes, you can do that, no problem, or no, you shouldn't do that, or I would revoice that chord. But another thing that social media was helpful for is I started this discussion of what is a string quartet?
Mm-hmm.
What do we understand by a string quartet? Because I really wanted to write a numbered string quartet for this, not a test piece, so what's the difference between a piece for string quartet and a string quartet? Capital S, capital Q. And what we came down to was that a string quartet had to have a sense of journey about it. I mean, we think about that kind of epic journey that happens in Mendelssohn and Beethoven and what have you. So it had to take up a lot of space. It had to have many different moods. It had to have fast and slow. The material had to sort of transform over the course of the piece. But that usually happens in 25 minutes, 30 minutes, not in 9 minutes. So the task became for me to try and create a space within this piece for that feeling of an epic piece. So I wanted a piece to feel longer than it is, which is normally not a good thing. But I wanted the piece to feel not longer, but bigger than it really is. So in 9 minutes, I wanted to give them space to do things that are actually very simple. There's space for slowness and contemplation and lyricism, but there's also all of that fast stuff that you come to expect from a string quartet. So that's one of the things that the piece is like. And I've already talked about the kind of polystylistic element of it, where it bops back and forth very quickly between very different styles. There's tango in it. I spent some time in Argentina many years ago and came back with a love of tango. So yeah, does that answer your question about what the piece is like?
Yeah, partly. Yeah.
So
Great.
that was the major intent.
Other questions? Yes.
You said you started working with them on Wednesday in person. How long have the quartets had the piece?
Barry should answer
I
that.
should know that answer, and I don't. I can't remember when we gave it to them. Miriam, are you here? When did we send them off? I think it was, I think they received it May? June. Thank you, Miriam. June.
So they've had a couple of months to
Yeah.
work on it.
Yeah.
Yes.
So Barry, this is your question. How do you choose the composer to do this?
Ooh, good question.
Yeah. Good question.
How do you choose
It's
the
a really good
composer?
question. So first of all,
I'm curious.
This commission is supported by 3 entities. Banff Center, through funding in honor of R.S. Williams, which provides the prize and supports this commission. CBC, which is our partner for many years, and they will broadcast the piece. And our friends at the American Society in New York. I identified the composer that we want to commission. I run that name by those other partners. And it's never happened that they said, no, that's not a good idea. We also listen. People tell us about composers. And how I got to Matt is I try to avoid all of the regular avenues of access that I had, because I ended up coming to the same names again and again and again. And those names are awesome. But I was interested in who is a Canadian composer that we actually haven't heard much of late. And 3 or 4 people had put Matt's name in front of me. And they said, yeah, I don't think you know this guy because he's living in Finland. And so I started to explore your repertoire in line, and what was exciting is that it wasn't a composer that we all are hearing a lot of in Canada, and it wasn't a composer that was writing a ton of music for string quartet. So there was something new that was coming to the process. We also, I started working in 2006 for the competition and looked back at the composers who had written, and there was, I think without anybody realizing, there was a kind of gender imbalance in how many of the compositions had been awarded to men. So you'll notice that this is I think the the 5th competition that I'm involved in, 4 of the 5 composers were female. That was intentional because we wanted to right the ship, and just in terms of balance. And so there are those things that come into it. And in Matt's case, we're really excited that he was based overseas, because our quartets, as part of the prize, go overseas and perform, and often bring this work along with them. And so it gives another element for drawing attention to our winner, because you're already there. So, you know, for instance, if we bring the winner of the Banff competition to perform in Helsinki, that's one thing. If we bring the winner of the Banff competition to perform in Helsinki and they're actually playing a piece that was composed in Banff by a Helsinki-based composer, that's interesting. So all of that comes into play. We have already chosen the composer for the next competition, and we'll announce that in due course. But I think it's one of the most amazing opportunities for any composer to have 40 people within 2 hours playing your music. And if you were to count the number of hours that each of these quartets has rehearsed your work, that's an unbelievable opportunity. The truth is that if you write a piece for the Calgary Philharmonic, let's say you wrote a 9-minute piece for the Calgary Philharmonic, is that an hour of rehearsal? Maybe?
Maybe, if you're lucky.
It's maybe an hour. So that's not their fault. They would love to rehearse more. It's too expensive. And so some incredible things happen, but not the things that are possible with actual committed rehearsal time. And that's something I think you should always remind yourself of. The irrational commitment of these performers to what they're doing.
And I have to say, I told a couple of the groups yesterday that I was working with, it's just to walk down a hallway and hear your music being played
cool.
at this absolute top international level from behind every door is humbling.
Yeah, well.
And the whole experience of this is just, it's one of those unrepeatable days that goes, with my wedding day and the day my son was born and other things, there's experiences that will not happen again.
It's great that you were able to give us the time and spend the week, because we want the composers to become part of this community. So you've been here for several days, and I encourage you, now know, if you haven't seen him before, you know what he looks like, so go up and talk to him. We have time probably for a couple quick questions. Anything in the back? Yes?
Yes, I wanted to ask you, Matt, many of your works have titles from nature.
I'm sorry, I can't see the questioner.
Many of your works have titles from nature.
Is that Jean?
It is.
I'm sorry, I'm going to embarrass you. This is Jean Schult. She was the chorus master at Vanier College in Montreal when I studied there in the early 90s. She premiered my very first composition.
That's awesome.
I'm sorry, yes, Jean, please.
The question is, many of your catalog pieces have titles from nature.
Yes.
Are they in fact programmatic, or is it are they random titles like this one?
Actually, the answer to all questions is yes and no. No, yes, a lot of my pieces have titles that refer to nature imagery or poetic sources, but I don't think that I write program music. For me, I'm a very visually oriented person. I don't like abstraction as a means of structuring a piece. This piece is actually utterly, almost unique in my output in that way, in that it's an entirely abstract piece. But normally I proceed from some sort of visual or poetic stimulus that provides a kind of shape for a piece, a kind of behavior. And it's a way of excluding ideas from myself. Everything that I do is about limiting myself so that I can make choices more easily. I don't sketch very much at all. I just sit down and write because I find if I sketch too much, I get lost in the detail. But the nature thing, because I'm just very passionate about the natural world, I'm a hiker, it's a very stimulating idea for me. The nature thing provides just a ground for me to think about how I want the piece to behave, how I want it to sound, how I want it to move through time. And from there it becomes a process of just finding material that sounds like that to me.
Interesting. Great. There was a yes in the back, yes, on the end, yep.
One of the standard definitions of a string quartet is that of a conversation among friends. So I'm kind of wondering, did you take the idea of interplay among musicians into this piece? Is that a major aspect of it or not?
So the question is that a string quartet is often referred to as a conversation among friends.
Or enemies in the case of Ives' second.
Yeah, yeah. And the question was whether you
Whether I take the conversation aspect, actually no. Because that to me implies things like counterpoint and theme and development, and those are ideas that fell away very quickly in my late 20s and early 30s as things I just wasn't interested in, because a lot of my influence comes from, as I mentioned, minimalism, but also from Renaissance choral music. I'm a choral singer. I have been most of my life. I still perform with a high-level amateur choir in Finland. And the discovery of Renaissance choral music for me was just this massive shock to the system, right alongside minimalism, of how you could structure music in different ways that weren't linear, that weren't conversational. So what you'll probably hear is that in this piece, and more generally, the strings are kind of treated as a group. They're a single instrument for the most part. Occasionally a little line will poke out, but mostly they're very much about four people contributing to this one single gesture.
Got it.
So it's less of a conversation and more of a, well, I don't know, you can decide that for yourself what it is.
Okay, let's